We continue with A Prophet for Today by Rabbi Stephen Prushansky, right, on Yehoshua, Jericho. And we were talking about the conquest of the land and the tragedy of the second battle. The first battle was Jericho. The second one was Ai. And we'll pick it up with an appropriate quote from Rav Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, who explained that in the land of Israel, Achdus, unity, is a literal concept. There the national soul was alive, and there our common destiny is felt most intensely. Like the unified body in the Malbim's analogy. Remember we spoke about the Malbim last week, and that he described that Israel was like a body, and that when the big toe hurts, the whole body hurts. That if you have an ingrown toenail, you can find yourself bedridden from it, right? It's just the toe that hurts. You know, many years ago, I had an infection in my hand. I'd been making a film in Angola, and I caught some bizarre thing there. Angola, yeah. I had a cut, and it got into my blood, and it came back years later. And when they did a nuclear X-ray of my hand, it was turning black, right, which is a sign that it's dying on you, right, your hand. And they put me on very strong antibiotics to kill the thing, and told me that I would be in the hospital for a month. For a month, right? And they didn't feel sick, just my thumb. That was it. But you couldn't at that point in Ontario, you couldn't do intravenous at home. You had to be in the hospital for intravenous. Now they do it at home as well, but you had to be in the hospital. So, you know, I spent a month there, and I was at one point I was sort of jogging around the room, just trying not to fall apart because you sit in the hospital for too long. And I went to the doctor and I said, "I'm not really sick. It's only my thumb. You know, can you get me out of this place? I have work to do." And he said, "I can get you out in 3 days." I said, "Well, let's get to it." He said, "I just have to take your thumb off. That's all." He said, and by the way, the thumb is what separates us from the monkeys. That was his view, right? So maybe you don't want to lose it. So I opted to stay in the hospital. The Malbim says that the thumb is not separate from the body. Whatever any part of the body is feeling, the whole body feels. Right? Rav Kook is taking this further to say, this is not. This may be true of all of Klal Yisrael everywhere in the world, and we know that, you know, in Toronto, if there's a Jew in Istanbul whose leg is hurting, we should feel that pain. But we know that Rav Kook says this is particularly true, viscerally true. You can feel it, you know, in the land of Israel. So he says here, there's a national soul is alive, and there our common destiny is felt, like the unified body in the Malbim's analogy.
Hello.
How are you? Can we get you something? Yeah, you okay? Okay. Only in Israel can real Aravut take place. The notion that all Jews are responsible and guarantors for one another. That feeling can exist in exile on some level, but it is experienced in its fullest sense only in Eretz Yisrael. In exile, Jews have a diminished capacity to experience all aspects of Jewish nationhood. In Israel, we as a people have the potential to be whole and therefore embrace a sense of collective responsibility. As such, when even one Jew sins, Hashem's protective hand can be withdrawn. We are left to the natural forces that govern the relations between states and people, with the potential for confrontation and deadly conflict.
It's an incredibly actual,
Very pertinent subject of the day. You know, remember when we began reading this book, we noted that Chazal tell us that if the Jews had not sinned, we would have been given 5 books. The 6 books, the 5 books of Moses, right? And the 5 books of Moses and Yehoshua, right? And that, and the reason that the books of the prophets of the Navi continue to be with us, the ones that we have, are because they are messages for us for today, not just a recording of past events. In the 16th century, Rabbi Levi Ibn Chaviv, who was the son of the author of Ein Yaakov, wrote, "For all Jews to be gathered together and merit divine providence, Hashgacha Protis, and miraculous intervention requires that every Jew be righteous. If even one Jew sins, then it is as if one limb of the body takes ill. We say not that the limb is ill, but the person is ill. And we become unworthy of Hashgacha Protis, and this is also true justice." We live as Jews in a very, very dangerous neighborhood. We are described as sheep among wolves. And we know that our existence and our survival, especially in the land of Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, but everywhere, is dependent on Hashgacha Protis, dependent on God protecting us. Right? And more than that, we know that from day to day, we don't have to be punished to be destroyed. We just have to be left to unprotected life. That our enemies, from a military point of view, are more powerful than we are. And so we are dependent for sure on our military, but only in a partnership with God. As we talked the other day, that there's a partnership that goes on between our military and God, and neither one, we will not survive without our military, and our military won't be effective if we are not godly.
And King David is a good example.
King David is a good example. The Maccabees are a great example, you know. Right? David Amelech, the Maccabees, you know, there's a long list. Huh?
Yeah.
Generally, but especially in Israel, this is true. Right? The individual persona of the Jew is muted and is superseded by his share in national identity. That is why Vidui, the confessional prayer recited on Yom Noraim, are always phrased in the plural. For we have committed before you. Achet, right? We never say in the Vidui at that time what I have done. It's always about us because we take responsibility for each other. You know, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev used to say about the Vidui. He said that the confession were al chet, right? He used to say that the people of his generation were much more honest than the people that came before. The time of the Gemara and time of the how so? Because when we say we have sinned this way, we're telling the truth. They didn't sin that way. They exaggerated. We're telling the truth when I say it, said Levi Yitzchak. So that should be in our merit. We do not merely confess our individual sins, but our vidui, our confession, has to account for the sins of all Jews, especially those who are not confessing them. They are our partners as well. This was Achan's fundamental error. A Jew cannot be an individualist who distances himself from the community and locks himself within his own 4 cubits, Daled Amos, or steeple. The Jewish life of every individual Jew has a profound public dimension to it. He is inextricably part of the community of Israel. Because we're asking this question. Achan himself, right, did something that was a violation of the orders given by God to Joshua and passed on to the people. You would think Achan would be the one who would be punished and everybody else would be okay. But we see here 36 people died and they were routed by the people of Ai, who were much weaker, right? It didn't have to happen. Right? There is no private Jews, and certainly regarding the land of Israel, every Jew is gripped by the holiness of the place and is indispensably bound to it.
Can I ask you a question? Private act or a private Jew? What does it mean? His act was...
That once we crossed the Yarden, right, there was an idea in the Midbar that if a Jew committed a sin in private, that the nation wasn't held responsible for it. That ended when we crossed the Yarden, right? And we see many different examples of it. You know, the cities of refuge, right? Why is the Kohen Gadol's mother going to the cities of refuge and saying, please don't curse my son so that you can get out of prison? Why does he have a liability? He has a liability because once he's Kohen Gadol and people make such mistakes, in manslaughter, where somebody gets killed by mistake, it means that he's not able to convey the sensitivity required to avoid such things. And he bears a responsibility. Right? That is to say, we all bear responsibilities even for things that we can't know about because of the tone we set in our world. Right? You know, it's most obvious in a person's home. Right? You know, parents can say one thing and act in another way, right? What does the child learn? He learns from their actions, not from what they say at that point.
But when you describe, it's just Joshua just crossed Jordan.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
The next thing, the guy decided to...
No, yeah, that's right.
You can't say that the atmosphere was wrong. What happened with the...
Obviously, it wasn't what it should be. Joshua did everything that he could. They all had bris milah. They all sat down for a seder. They followed all the rules. They had a marvelous victory in Jericho. Right? But one person had this desire to be greedy, to take what was not his, to take what belonged to God. Right?
Just happened.
And obviously, he didn't get the message that the rest of the nation did, right? And this was critical, especially because it was the first, right? This was the first moment that the Jewish people as a nation had entered the land of Israel.
Maybe it was so dramatic,
right?
Because it was the first.
Of course it was. You know, the bolt of the door to Israel had been opened by God. Where's the Hakaras Hatov? Right? Nobody had died. 9 armies were inside Jericho, Canaanite armies waiting to fight. They were crushed.
It was just post-war traumatic syndrome.
You're being very kind. Post-war traumatic syndrome was probably for the people of Jericho. You know, the people of Israel hadn't had to fight. They didn't fight. They won without fighting. Right? They blew shofars. You know?
Yeah, still probably a very stressful situation before the walls fell down, you know.
I don't know. It was, you know, the Yarden had stopped for them as they crossed the river, right? They'd seen the Aron HaKodesh up close, you know. It was going pretty well. And by the way, they didn't have to, unlike, you know, at the Yam Suf where they were being chased, they were marching forward. They weren't running away from anything.
No. They were going straight.
Yeah.
Is there any saying...
And there was no question in Joshua's mind who was going to win.
Is there any mention of genealogy of Achan, where it comes from?
It's a good question. I'll check. I don't know off the top of my head. No, he was from Yehuda. If you're asking where he's from. Yeah, he was Shevet Yehuda.
He wasn't part of...
He was Shevet Yehuda. Pure and clear.
He
Kings
was a part
come
of
from
Arab
Europe.
Rab or anything like this.
Shevet Yehuda.
Yeah. Kings are coming
Yeah.
from Europe.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the most comprehensive expression of the public aspect of Jewish life is only found in Eretz Yisrael and not in Galus. Achan Sin purported to renounce this principle. He professed that a Jew can have individual sin, and that what one Jew does not need, and what one Jew does, need not affect all other Jews. That was his fatal mistake, a denial of the collective responsibility that is the essence of our attachment to the land of Israel. Such an approach to Jewish life had to be repudiated by Yehoshua in the most dramatic way. Rav Dessler underscores this point with a slight variation. It's true that every Jew is a representative of the Jewish people generally, but if Achan sinned, it meant that there was something deficient in the community as a whole. This is the point I was making before. That the environment in which Achan lived was not sufficiently sanctified so as to preclude the possibility of anyone harboring heretical thoughts or illegitimate desires. You know, for most of us, at this point in our lives, there are certain things that we cannot imagine doing. There's certain behaviors that we just can't imagine it.
That's true.
You know. Why? Because it's the milieu that we live in. The rest of the world does these activities constantly, normally. They don't even find it as inappropriate. You know.
So you want to tell me something was wrong with the leadership?
Something was wrong. Let's listen to what he says.
So what was wrong with the golden calf? What was wrong with the leadership there?
I would argue about the egel, that the egel was a provocation, that there was a very, very dangerous element within Klal Yisrael that had left with Moshe's guarantee. You know, God and Moshe had a conversation about the Erev Rav, and Moshe said, "I am their guarantor."
So and God was Klal Yisrael, it was Erev Rav.
God was not happy about it. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And in the end, I would argue that Aaron HaKohen created a provocation that revealed to his brother what they were dealing with. Because if you remember the final words before the end of the scene, is Moshe comes down and he blames Aaron. And Aaron says, these people are parua. Parua, right? These people that you left me with, right, are like Pharaoh. Same word. The same word. Parua and Pharaoh, exactly the same word.
So why Jews were punished?
And what does it say about Moshe at that point? What does it say about Moshe at that point? It says his eyes were opened. His eyes had been closed to the evil that was around him.
He saw
right?
what he's dealing with.
When his brother said it, it said his eyes were opened, and he said, "Who is with God, stand with me."
Right.
There was no conscription. There was a voluntary effort. Who came? The Levium came with their swords, and they did what they had to do. And if you think for a moment, later on, go forward in the Midbar, and understand there was another rebellion, Korach. Imagine for a moment, right, what would have happened in the rebellion of Korach if those 3,000 were still alive and operating. Right? Now, God can always intervene and make a miracle, and that'll do it. But God doesn't like to operate that way. Right?
The earth opened and swallowed all. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is it may not have even gotten that far. Right?
What is the reason the Jews was punished?
What was
because
the reason? The Jews were involved too.
Yeah.
Jews were involved too. Right? The Erev Rav said, "This is your God," to Israel. Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of Israel said, "Okay. We're interested."
And all Jews was punished. Even
no, not all the Jews were punished. No.
Not all of them. There was a different level.
No, there were different levels of punishment. Some were killed by the Levium. Some were killed by the ground up gold, which was really the first sota, right? Some were killed by a plague, each on different levels, and some were fine. right? And Baruch Hashem, the women got her out, no problem, right? Their husband should have listened to them. Okay.
God said to Abraham, listen to your wife.
Listen to Sarah.
That's right.
That's right.
Actually, his wife.
He said to your wife. Right?
To your wife, yeah. Okay, so Rav Joe says it meant that there was something deficient in the community as a whole, that the environment in which Achan lived was not sufficiently sanctified so as to preclude the possibility of anyone harboring heretical thoughts or illegitimate desires. This then is a societal problem. So Hashem challenged Yehoshua. Israel has sinned, right? And he wouldn't tell him who. The sin is borne by everybody at this point, which wasn't true in the Midbar. Remember that. An abomination that occurs in the Jewish community is a sign that the community has at some level tolerates or condones such acts or does not bear the requisite horror at its commission. It need not even reach the level of having the opportunity to protest and not protesting.
It means that people saw this.
It can manifest itself as an unwillingness to rebuke the sinner that stems from misplaced humility. But not from misplaced humility, but from a liberal notion of tolerance, the American virtue of live and let live, or even from the sympathy or a vicarious identification with the sinner. That type of tolerance reflects poorly on the Jewish community and its microscopic deficiency. In the moral level of the Jewish community, Rav Dessler laments, there is a limit to the individual autonomy of any Jew, for the community pays the ultimate price for actions of even one renegade. Achan's sin was all of our sins. Achan, yeah? Can you
to the subject. Still confused. Does it sound like a positive feature that the whole nation was responsible for the sin of one? Because you know what? I am comparing with, cruel despot Stalin. His principle was the family, the kids are responsible for the sins of their parents. He would send to exile whole families or communities. Recent, like Tatars of the Crimea.
Yeah, the Chechens
is
too.
responsible for the thing. So one was a traitor, the rest were. So how it is correlated?
So what is the difference between God and Stalin is the question. Is it right? Okay, it's a good question.
He took
it's a very good question. Because there's a concept, you're right, there's a concept of collective responsibility, which in the hands of man we abhor. We absolutely abhor, right? Part of it is that there's no balance to it. There's no such thing as collective reward. Stalin used collective, as did Makshmo, as did Hitler Makshmo, used collective punishment as a way of exacting punishment and revenge.
Israeli do the same. Israeli do the same.
What do you mean?
If somebody was bombing himself, some terrorists, they would come to their houses and just destroy them, the entire house.
No.
Not anymore.
Nothing to compare with that.
I don't think Israelis do not kill the whole family. The guy they kill this whatever, but they don't kill the whole family. No.
What she's saying is
about Stalin and Israel.
So
it's wrong comparison.
That's one thing, but not destroying the family like Stalin did.
Okay.
So let me stay with this thought. So if you have collective punishment, you should have collective reward. If you only have collective punishment, then it's very one-sided. We understand that the Jews have tremendous collective rewards, right? They have tremendous benefits from the people, as a nation are benefiting. We see it here, right? That those people who are tzaddikim, and those people who are shoyim, and those people who are Beinoni in the middle, right? All had the benefits of the victory in Yericho. All had the benefits of the destruction of the Mitzrayim. All had the benefits of the wealth that came out of it. And they were all told very clearly that the rules of the game are this, that you are one body, right? Mm-hmm. And remember we talked about this previously, the idea that if Jews are one body, right, then it is in the nature of that situation that the body suffers from the pain of the foot. Mm-hmm. Right? We shouldn't be surprised by it. And we should be aware that when the body is healthy, the entire body is healthy. Right? And that sometimes this body is healthy even beyond what the merit it deserves to be. Right? And we see, over and over and over that, the fact that we're here at all, as that we're sitting around this table, that we have a company from Eretz Yisrael with us, that this is entirely a miracle in itself. If history followed its normal process, there would be no Jews. There are no Babylonians, there are no Romans. We all know the story. It's a boring story to tell. But they were mightier than we were. They conquered greater lands than we did. They were more numerous than we were, right? And where are they now?
Absolutely.
They are in, to quote Khrushchev, the dustbin of history. Was it Khrushchev? Yeah, dustbin of history. Yeah. Right? And we, as Mark Twain said, are still as vital, still as powerful as we were when Abraham walked this earth.
Only
right?
Just exhibited in the museum.
And that's, to me, that's a pure miracle. And historians call us a mistake of history.
Mistake of history.
Right, a mistake of history. Right. It's not a mistake.
It's not a mistake.
It's miraculous, is what it is. Right?
Absolutely, it's a miracle.
Anyway, with that miracle, right, comes a great deal of responsibility. And that's the point here, is that Achan was the first example under the new rules where we're responsible for each other, that a terrible mistake was made at a very crucial moment. And it impacted, and a message had to be sent, and it was.
Does it include responsibility to be a role model for the other nations?
For sure. If we were able to fulfill our responsibility this year, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, right, to be a holy nation, to be a nation in line with Torah, right, to have a Chavas Yisrael truly for each other, right, to be caring, right, Mashiach would be here, and the other nations would flock to us to say, how do you do this right? Sure. Right? Obviously, nobody's looking at Israel right now and saying, gee, how do you do this right? Right?
But did you mean that this is a model for other nations?
What?
When one person responds, was your question?
No. The current situation with the Jewish nation, responsible for everything, responsible for the whole world, and responsibility means you are the best, as comes from his explanation. And role model means you are the best in this world.
When I was a child,
an exemplary nation to follow.
The light to the nations. So we have to the perspective how it should be.
In the 1950s, when I was a child, every time you went to shul, there was only one conversation. Those that made the desert bloom. The miracle that made the desert bloom. Am I right?
Yeah.
This was what we lived with all the time, right? But the miracles that have happened since then make that one look nice but kind of quaint historical. The most powerful army in the Middle East. It's a tiny country, right? The center of Torah learning. It's not in Lakewood, right? It's not in Brooklyn. It's not in Mir in Russia. It's moved to Israel. Right. These are all messianic things. The industry, the high tech, right? The growth of the country, right? None of them are separate. They're all intermingled. They're all together, and we all need to know that this is part of Yad Hashem. All of it is.
6-Day War. Same thing.
The 6-Day War. All of these things are. We should. It's interesting because. The people who are not of our faith, evangelicals, understand this as a miracle from beginning to end, from moment to moment, right? And we have trouble understanding it. Right? And, by the way, to be sufficiently grateful for it. Hakaras Hatov, which is, if there is a Jewish characteristic, that should be one of them, right? Is to realize that every victory, every growth, every yeshiva, every military unit, every high-tech improvement, every one of those things is entirely a miracle that our grandparents could not have imagined.
Right.
Could not have imagined.
So you want to say that we don't have enough gratitude to Hashem?
For sure.
That's
for sure. If we did, we would
absolutely
be thanking God
even
constantly with great sincerity.
Coming from Russia, saying on Seder Pesach in 70s, 60s, next year in Jerusalem, it was like dream.
And it's what it says in benching, right?
No,
it is a dream.
Israel, it was existed. Israel was existed already.
I know.
But it was miracle. It was like something that, and suddenly.
You know, in the 1950s,
it was a dream.
In the 1950s in New York, life was good. Life was very good. It was, you know, the golden years for America. It didn't suffer as much in the war as everybody else did, and things were quite good. But somebody who went to Israel, right, 1956, 57, and came back to New York, everybody would gather around him.
Yeah,
tell us about this. Everybody's child goes to Israel for a year now. It's normal, right? People go visit Israel. They get on a plane, they go, they come back. There were planes then, but no, you know, it was like, please, come, we'll gather the whole shul together and talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. And it didn't matter whether it was a Reform or a Conservative Orthodox shul. You know, people would sit at that person's feet, tell us about it. Right?
And Golden Era came to Russia.
Now it is a child who finishes high school and doesn't spend a year in Israel. It's abnormal for us now. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it's not just the religious. You know, birthright, this, that, you know, everybody's trying. This is, to me... you know, somebody once told me that if we have to wait till the year 6000 for Mashiach, another 250 years, heaven forbid, if we have to do this, right? We won't even notice that it's a miracle.
We'll take it.
No, it's well, he got elected prime minister. You know, whatever. You know, okay, that's it, right? And that's how it is, right? You know, everything is in place, and we hardly notice that it's a miracle. Right,
no,
you know,
we're heading. You know, think that we're heading that way.
We are heading. No, it's not what to think. We are heading that way for sure.
That That's what I say.
Doesn't mean that the road is not easy.
Yeah, but we'll take it for granted.
But you know, it's a world of miracles. It's a world of Nissim, right?
Right.
And it's appropriate to talk about it right after, because by the way, Purim is a perfect example of it.
That's right.
If I tell you a nace is to see the sea split, to see the plagues, right? Something like, yeah, okay. If I tell you the nace is the king was reading about Mordechai, it's a coincidence, you would think, right? We all know what coincidences are, right? But the whole Purim story is a series of non-miraculous coincidences that when you see it from above, suddenly you understand this is a nace. Mm-hmm. Israel is very similar. The growth of Israel is very similar. You know, Google sees Israel as a center, right? You know,
the headquarters.
You know, what's that about? Oh, Jews are so smart. They're so clever, right? The Japanese are clever too. The Koreans are clever too, right? Indians are great mathematicians. You know, what's going on, right? You know.
Maybe this is what happened with the Achan.
Little Anna.
Maybe this is what happened with Achan. They just had 40 miraculous years. Then they have at the end very dramatic, miraculous experience with Jordan. And then he got used to it. It's become norm. And when something becomes norm, it's
well, you're right. The generation of the Midbar, for them, you know, breakfast should have been a miracle.
For us, it's right. For them, it was wrong.
Yeah.
You know.
They got used to
you know, and by the way, you know, if you think about, you know, for Russian Jews, right? You know, it was a campaign that was on the tongues of religious and non-religious Jews day in and day out, you know, in the 70s. You know, protest here, protest there, go to the UN, go to the consulate, right?
At the end of 60s.
You know, Now it's like a historical event, and God willing, comfortable here. We have what to worry about for our brothers now, once again.
Everyone is fed up with Russian Jews.
What?
Everyone is already fed up.
They wanted them here and they got it.
Yeah, no, we wanted them to leave Russia. We didn't want them to come here. Go somewhere.
Exactly.
No, just kidding. Okay.
So there is over 1 million of them just staying in Russia.
Achan's mistake. Achan's name emerged from Yehoshua's lottery as the guilty party. He drew lots. And Achan immediately protested. Because of this lottery, I'm going to be executed? Achan thought to himself, now that I am trapped, I am better off denying the validity of the lottery. So Yehoshua will think I am a liar, but all Israel will not think me a criminal. Achan said to Yehoshua, instead of you drawing lots between me and my family, let me draw lots between you and Pinchas.
What is
This is from Midrash Rabbi. Remember how he was chosen, right? Was that a lot was drawn to decide which Shevet it came from, then which family it came from, and then within the family which individual it was, right? Because God wouldn't reveal to Yehoshua. He didn't want to be a talebearer. He said, you'll have to find this out for yourself, right? I won't be part of it. Yehoshua answered calmly and even soothingly, my son, please give honor to Hashem and confess to him. Yehoshua is saying, the jig is up. Now, if you intend to survive, right, and if you intend to have the world to come, it would be good to confess now, before it gets worse. Tell me, please, what you have done. Do not withhold anything from me. This is from Yehoshua 7:19. Hold on. But Achan's complaint is seemingly valid and unaddressed by Yehoshua. It's as if Yehoshua ignored his issue and just moved forward. By the time the lot is limited to a choice between two people, invariably one will be selected. What then is the proof of Achan's guilt? How did Yehoshua refute Achan's argument? Additionally, and ominously, Achan challenged Yehoshua's authority. The Jewish people suddenly split into warring factions. Right? So Achan's behavior, right, first with taking that which belonged to God, secondly, refusing to admit when the lots had chosen to him, and then finally, disputing the authority of Yehoshua himself, divided the nation at that moment in a very painful situation, and in a way in which one could only assume that God would look at his children and not be so happy with them.
But it means some people felt was Achan special, or is just the idea that he was accused?
Listen,
I guess.
the tribe of Yehuda arose and began killing other factions who were contending with them. At that point, Achan said to himself, whoever saves one life in Israel, it is as if he saved the entire world. Okay, be well, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Good to see you.
Try to leave this. We have to make a special day in
We'll do it.
Yomam V'Layla.
Amen.
Take care. And then
Be well.
I think it's on the table, on the desk.
Because of me, the Jews are being killed, and I am a sinner and one who causes others to sin. Better that I should confess to Hashem and Yehoshua.
After they start killing.
In the middle, yeah. So this disaster does not come to pass on my account. Right.
It's already.
He was stopping it when he realized what was happening. He then confessed fully, completely, and voluntarily. What prompted Achan to confess? From where did he generate this concern for the community of Israel? So it seems that Achan, in order to sin, separated himself from Israel and said, it's my business, right? And now something seems to have changed. Achan's contrition and repentance were notable for another reason as well. He admitted taking the garment and the money and then added to the assembled, you should not think that I took all this wealth because I was poor. On the contrary, I am the richest member of my tribe. Does this remind anybody of somebody else? Korah. So why did he take it? What dynamic was taking place beneath the surface of these exchanges? Achan attacked the lottery system and the divine providence, Hashgacha Pratis, that suggested it as mass assault on Yehoshua's authority. This was the first and very subtle rebellion against Yehoshua. His master Moshe had been less fortunate, having to ward off a number of serious, palpable threats to his leadership. But Achan based his challenge to Yehoshua on grounds similar to those of Moshe's arch-rival Korach. It is true that I deny the efficacy of the lottery. More importantly, I have looked into the Torah myself, and we were promised that everything will be in the city, all of its booty, may you plunder for yourselves. That's a quote from Devarim. Right? In Devarim it says, when you conquer a city, you can take the loot for yourself. So we are inherently allowed to take spoils. You, Yehoshua, are distorting the Torah for your own personal reasons. This sounds so much like Korach. You are a descendant of Yosef, termed by Yaakov a Nazir Echav, the most abstinent of the brothers. Who are you to impose your stringencies on all of us? I did not take spoils because I needed them, but to prove a broader point. Yehoshua is corrupting the Torah, and that is intolerable.
This is what he said when he admitted.
This is based on Bamidbar Rabbah, this statement, right? A medrash. Achan's grievance focused on two different areas and quickly drew supporters, as every malcontent always does. In fact, as noted, the tribe of Yehuda was ready to wage war to uphold these two sacred principles. So what do we have? We have a world in which Yehuda seems to be ruled by Yosef.
Yehuda?
Seems to be ruled by Yosef, right? Because Yeshua ben Nun is from the tribe of Yosef, right?
You mean whole Klal Israel was...
Yeah.
Again, tribal contradiction.
But this is ridiculous because he's not a king.
Yehoshua.
Yes.
But he's successor of Moshe.
It's an interesting question whether he's a king or not. We call him a Navi.
Because if they're talking about kings. He's not saying I'm kings.
You know, it's an interesting question because
Moshe appointed him.
It's an interesting question because there is an issue as to whether Moshe himself is the first king of Israel.
Moshe,
right? There's a discussion about whether the laws that apply to kings apply to Moshe as the first king of Israel, as the undisputed leader of Israel. Moshe then appointed Yehoshua to succeed him. Yehoshua we consider to be a Navi, and after the Nevi'im, then there were the judges who ruled as well, before we had a king, right? Shaul was the first king. Moshe's position is a very interesting position because he served as king, he served as Kohen Gadol, and he served as a spiritual leader in a sense, and a prophet. You know, we think of him as our teacher. Interestingly enough, we don't call him Melech. We don't call him Navi. We call him Rabbi.
But we know that nobody else but Cohen could, for example, bring sacrifice. Moshe did.
Right.
It means he was unique.
Yeah, that's right.
He was a Cohen.
That's right.
He was when he put Mishkan, you know.
Yeah. And plus, when Moshe went up to Mount Sinai,
he was a Rabbeinu.
Right.
He took with himself.
Call him Rabbeinu.
He took Yeshua.
He taught us Torah.
Halfway up.
He was leader of generation.
Only Yeshua was allowed.
Yeah.
Nobody, even the tribe of Yehuda.
That's right.
They were sitting down near the mountain.
That's right.
So what is all this about?
So, but Yehuda was understood.
He was chosen by God.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But Yehuda was. Let's have one conversation, okay? Masha, one conversation, okay? Okay. But you know, regardless of whether your leadership is the leadership of a Moshe Rabbeinu or a Navi, like Yehoshua, or a judge like Shmuel, in the background there's always Yehuda, chosen by Yaakov, chosen by Moshe to be the family of kings. Right? So when there are going to be kings, whenever that moment comes, that leadership will fall to, should fall to Yehuda. We know when it fell to Binyamin that it didn't work out under Shaul. We know when it fell to Levi under the Maccabees, under the Hezboneans, that it didn't work out well. That Yehuda is uniquely bred for kingship, and will continue to be in the future. That Mashiach will come from Yehuda. So Yehuda has this quality that is not determined with David HaMelech, but is determined by Yaakov and confirmed by Moshe. So maybe it's not a surprise that they have this feeling. I would argue that it shouldn't be a surprise.
Being disagreeing with existing leader.
They are the lion, right? They are the lion cub, that is destined to be kings, whose brothers will follow them. You read the blessing from Yaakov, right?
Right, but
they're not firstborn, right?
What is the definition of the king?
The
king cannot be king around in the nation that doesn't have their own land,
its own kingdom. He's the king.
It's kingdom. They don't have kingdom.
That's exactly what I told them. They have the country.
It's true.
They don't have country. They still have to conquer the country.
Who is the king? Watch the movie.
No, but a king can conquer a country too, right? Yeah. But in any case, we're not. It's a moot point. It's a moot point because Yehoshua is not a king. He's a Navi. We call him a Navi, right? What I'm saying is, what is the state of mind of Yehuda when it is not leading the people? Right? It didn't find out that its leadership comes with David HaMelech. It knew it from Yehuda himself. Yehuda himself was chosen to be the leader of his brothers, right? So that Moshe chooses Yehoshua, right? God chooses Yehoshua to be the leader. I don't think there's a dispute about that. No dispute about that. Right. That he's not a king, I think we all agree with that, right? What I'm saying is, what is the state of mind of the descendants of Yehuda when they are not in power, when one of their tribe is attacked, right? They fight back. How do they fight back, right? They fight back by saying, hey, by the way, you know who's supposed to be leading right now, right? They have their own arguments, right? Clearly, Achan realized that he was creating a disaster, right? And I think it's a lesson, for us today in the land of Israel, is that when you're causing such divisions, and potentially bloodshed, right, you should stop and think and say, am I outside of this whole process that I will be responsible for the blood of my brothers killing one another? Better stop it now. Right? And confess what I'm doing at that point.
Was he killed at the end? What's the end of the story?
I'm not getting ahead.
In Hebrew we say tachlis.
Achan's grievance focused on two different areas and quickly drew supporters, as every malcontent does. In fact, as noted, the tribe of Yehuda was ready to wage war to uphold these two sacred principles. Yehoshua was challenged as a religious authority, and his usurpation of the power of king and court trampled on the rights of the tribe of Yehuda as the royal house of Israel. They were content to allow Yehoshua to lead them into the land as Moshe had instructed, but they were not ready to abdicate their royal prerogatives and permit Yehoshua to rule as a monarch, even summarily executing one of their own tribesmen. Essentially, without a base din.
Summarily? I don't know the word.
Summarily is without normal jurisprudence, right? Through a lottery process as opposed to evidence and witnesses and a base din.
Maybe God saw something in Yehoshua that he didn't see still in tribe of Yehuda, because it was like, it was like something that Joseph, he was king, second to king in Egypt, so maybe his tribe, through his true sons, something was still going through something of this. And
by the way, it doesn't end, of course, right?
And that's
because what happens? Yehuda was a king, and Yosef was a king. But if you think about it at the moment, Yehuda was a king of what?
Future Israel.
future Israel. But at that moment,
no
nothing.
No, there was
Right.
no land yet.
Yosef was a king of Mitzrayim.
Galus.
He was a king of Mitzrayim. And in fact, it seems to me, when you observe it, that they are both kings. Yosef has a prediction in his dreams that he will be a king and rule over his brothers.
Right.
But Yaakov says it will be Yehuda who will rule over his brothers. What we learn is that Yosef seems to be the perfect king of non-Jews.
That's right.
Right? He made Egypt a power that it never was. He was so brilliant, right? He struggled with the court, he struggled with nations, and made Egypt what it became, right? Made it actually so great that eventually even his brothers could be enslaved. It's a tragedy, but it's true. Tragedy, but it's true. And this was part of God's plan. There's no question about it, right? Now there's an interim happening where they're not in the Midbar anymore, but they're not in the established nation of Israel anymore, right? So it would be natural that there's a kind of tug of war going on here. Now this tug of war, it doesn't end here, right? Because we know that after Shlomo Melech, the nation divided again, with Ephraim in the north ruling as kings. It was a disaster, right? And Yehuda continuing to rule in the south, where the Beis Hamikdash was, but it certainly wasn't good. Right, and the Purim story we learn more, but we won't go into that.
Maybe because they still were, mentally, maybe somehow they were in Egypt, in Galus. So maybe that's why they needed Yehoshua, because Yehoshua comes from Joseph, and they need king as Joseph for the Galus.
The questions pull back into
I'll react to it later, okay?
Don't forget.
Okay. Essentially, Achan restated the arguments of the spies against Moshe's temporal authority and those of Korach against Moshe's spiritual authority. Whereas the spies and Korach challenged Moshe in the second year of Moshe's tenure, Achan challenged Yeshua in the second month of Yeshua's leadership. These were two populist arguments. Who are you to change the rules, and who appointed you altogether? This was a major crisis that threatened to undermine the Jewish national life almost as soon as the Jews entered the land of Israel. The contentions of the spies succeeded in destroying an entire generation, and the reasoning of Korach almost succeeded, but for God's intervention in turning the entire nation against Moshe Rabbeinu. Achan appealed to the people as an ideologue, as a demagogue, that they should recognize the power inherent in them, in them as individuals, not Yehoshua, and that they would have fallen under the wheels of tyranny but for his self-sacrifice. Achan proposed that every Jew exercise his democratic right to pass judgment on the leadership loudly and vociferously. There is nothing as attractive as citizens in a free society as the uninhibited right to denounce their leadership, especially if there are no consequences to them.
If it's democratic society, they can vote out God.
Yeah. How did Yehoshua respond? Maybe we can learn from Yehoshua's response, and then we'll pause for today. How did Yehoshua respond? My son, this is firstly a dispute among family members. Don't exacerbate the problem. He referred to him as a relative, my son. Please give honor to God. Confess to God. Tell me, please, what you have done. Do not withhold anything from me. Secondly, do not impugn the integrity of the lottery system, because such a system will be used to divide the land of Israel among the tribes. At the very least, admit that the lot is accurate and reliable. There is no other way to equitably determine who gets what parcel of land in Israel. And if people lose faith in the lottery, we will never be able to dwell in the land. Neither you nor I can effectively decide how the land will be fairly distributed, and that is why the lottery system, based on divine will, was in place. It was a brilliant political maneuver. Yehoshua said that the lottery benefits everybody. If the people were inclined to accept the lottery for the distribution of the land, they would certainly accept it for the determination of the identity and fate of a single malefactor. In one swift stroke, Yehoshua validated the lottery as the most impartial means of allocating the land, and thereby deprived Achan and of his following and his most compelling argument. Achan realized that if the people do not accept the Goral, and they must, regarding the allocation of the land of Israel, they will accept because it had been given to Moshe, this rule. They will accept the conclusions regarding his fate as well. Yehoshua legitimized the Goral as the most equitable system, and in front of the people ratified the involvement of Hashgacha protists in these affairs. When Korach rebelled, God himself had to confirm Moshe's authority through the earthquake that swallowed up Korach and his followers. Here, Yehoshua had accomplished the same goal by persuading Achan to validate the Goral and reveal the will of Hashem.
Not what it told him, if you will not accept the Goral, so the nation is on the brink of civil war.
Yeah, it was clear that it was, right?
Goral to судьба.
Is a lottery. It's a lottery.
Yeah, but it's
civil war.
So the first lottery in the history of humankind. Lottery.
Yeah. The first, by the way, there's another word for it, right? Pur.
Poor.
Pur. The plural of it is Purim.
Yeah.
Right. It means lottery.
Жребий.
Right. Why? Because Haman, years later, would choose which date.
Yeah.
He chose the month of Adar because the greatest of all Jews had died in Adar, on the 7th of Adar, Moshe Rabbeinu. This was a misjudgment because he was also born on the 7th of Adar. Right? But then he had to choose which day in Adar, and he did through a Pur, through drawing the lottery. Came up with the 14th.
So Purim came
Purim, Purim, it's a separate conversation, but it's very strange to name a holiday. You know, if it had been called Esther's Day or Mordechai's Day, it would have made more sense. No. But to name a holiday after the very system that was used to try to destroy the Jews is a very curious thing, but not for this shir.
Okay.
So let me just review a tiny bit where we're standing here. Great victory in Yericho. Everybody understands that Yericho is a symbol to exist forever. It should never be rebuilt, right? Should never be rebuilt. The walls should always be evident that they fell into the ground. All of the valuables of Yericho go to God. Unlike any other situation, they go to God. Nobody touches it. The victory is 100% great success. The greatest of all military formations is destroyed. Yericho is destroyed. They move on to Ai, right? And they're told by Pinchas, don't send everybody there. We can wipe them out with 2,000-3,000 men. They're routed by a relatively weak force, right? What was the cause of it? Spiritual failure, right? Disobeying the will of God, right? Mm-hmm. How do they find out about it? One person from the tribe of Yehuda took what he shouldn't have taken, right? Causes everything to fail, right? He's required to make amends. He refuses to. He makes a big political speech, which seems to be turning the tide in favor of him, right? And then Yehoshua brings it back, and Achan realizes, what am I doing here? I'm destroying the nation. I'm causing a civil war, and backs off. And accepts responsibility. We'll find out next week. We'll find out what happens to Achan next week, right?
You know, cliffhanger.
But Achan repeats what both the spies and Korach did, right? And he repeats it as we are on the doorstep, entering the land, a gift from God. The effect of what he does is something that is with us today. Right? We'll learn more about it next week.
Okay. Thank you very, very much.